Beginning Beginning in genealogy, sometimes religious records are a little bit difficult to understand because they're usually in Latin or they could possibly be in the vernacular, that is the language of the local population. And as you know, there are 5 major religions of the world. This particular program today is going to discuss mostly the Christian and Jewish religious areas. The other religions, Hindu, Buddhism, Islam, that comprise the 7 major religions of the world, certainly has had influence on Christianity and Judaism. So I want to show you a little YouTube video. It's just a little under a minute. And what I would like you to focus on is the red information illustrating Hinduism, the gold or yellow Buddhism, Christianity, purple, and Judaism, and finally Islam in green. It's really quite an interesting overview because it really gives you a sense from 3000 BC, that's before Christ, to approximately 2000, what did the areas of the world look like as far as religion is concerned. There is no words to this presentation. It's just a visual representation of the map of the world and the 5 major religions and how they have emerged. So I trust that when it comes on, you'll be able to see the information. Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity evolving. See your timeline at the bottom. Spread of Islam. North and South America. Well, I hope that's given you a different perspective on how different religions have emerged over time. And one of the areas that I think is an important area for you to consider is the area of religion that Judaism evolved. And you saw on the map of the world that Judaism started and permeated throughout the globe. And we refer to the Torah, which was the Old Testament, putting together the teachings of Judaism. And then also the Talmud, which is also written scripture that occasionally we consider. And so when we look at Judaism, it's important that you understand that unlike Christianity, there are no sacraments, but they do have, like Christianity, a lot of rabbinical laws that tell people how to live and have various life cycle rituals, holy days, and other kinds of areas of religious life that they discuss. Usually the Judaism followers have the Sabbath as far as their celebration, their religious celebration, as well as Friday evening and Saturday morning. They do record the attendance at their synagogues. Now, important to note that Judaism is passed through the maternal line. So if your mother is Jewish, then you're Jewish, even though you may not practice Judaism. So let's look at some of the records and where you're going to find them. If you have an interest in Jewish records, because oftentimes, especially in Western Europe, people may have converted to have saved themselves. And so they adopted Christianity, even though they were Jewish. You can go to jewishgen.org for a lot of great records in Jewish records, synagogue, cemetery, and all different kinds of immigration records. They also have a large resource information documents about those that participated and survived the Holocaust, the Eastern European records. So that may be an important area for you to go to, jewishgen.org. Now, some of the other records that you might not be familiar with, but could possibly have information regarding your ancestor because they were in Eastern Europe. They are called the Landsman Shaft records. And these would be membership records of various groups that came together not only to worship, but for economic purposes. The Yitzer books are also memorial books that are going to be remembering those that died in the Holocaust. So going to Jewish Gen would give you a lot of great information about Jewish resources that you may want to look at. Don't limit yourself just to thinking that, oh, I'm not Jewish, because oftentimes jewishgen.org has a lot of Eastern European records. And as I mentioned, oftentimes people converted to Christianity just to save themselves. So for the purposes of this presentation, we're going to be talking about Christian ceremonial events, primarily baptism, marriage, and burial. So when we look at the record types in baptism, marriage, and burials, we have to consider the fact that these records may be handwritten. They are actually large books that might be held in a church or in a diocese or some other type of ecumenical location or archival location. They also could be microfilmed, and the microfilms could be available through the Family History Center that is located on Peterson Lane in Sonoma County. Or they could be digitized. And so these records could have various forms for you to consider. Important then to understand your timeline and find out whether or not the record does exist, and if it does, in what format does the record exist. Also, it's important for us to remember that vital records are different than a liturgical event. Vital records are usually the documents or the recording of an event in somebody's life to the authority in the local area. So whatever the government may be, the jurisdiction may want to have parents record the birth of their child, or if somebody should die, there's a death certificate that is filed in the jurisdiction. So it's important to understand that a liturgical event may not be considered a vital record. In other words, the government itself, in most cases, would not have relied on the church, whatever Christian church, to record any type of jurisdictional information. So let's first talk about baptism. This was, for most people, the first opportunity they had to declare their Christian faith. And as an infant, you were born with no grace, and baptism provided you the opportunity to have grace. And so the ceremony of baptism was for the infant to receive grace as opposed to a believer. So someone as an adult may have decided to become a member of that faith and were baptized in the norm of that particular religion as a believer. Again, remember, the vital record is not the infant baptism, but rather a liturgical event. Really important to understand that parents were compelled by their religion to get their child baptized immediately after birth. In the Church of England, Episcopalian, it was suggested that the following Sunday after birth, that the parents were to bring their child to the church to be baptized in front of the entire congregation. In Germany, if you were Lutheran, you were given 3 calendar days after the event. Again, the opportunity here for you to baptize your child in that particular religion was paramount as an obligation by the parent to the church. And why would this be so important? Well, no doubt we've all heard of the term limbo. And this is the situation if a child is not baptized, their soul is destined to be in limbo. In other words, it has no grace, but it has created, obviously, no problems within their lives, but they could not see God, if you will. And so, because they were not baptized, so they were then destined to a life in limbo. So this might sound a little bit odd to us today, but if you were espousing the following of your church, these were issues that were extremely important, and you certainly did not want to shirk your responsibility. When we look at the records that are usually in a baptismal certificate, it notes the date, the name of the child, the father's name, and curiously, not always the mother's name, and who was there, the officiate, as well as the sponsors. And so oftentimes it's going to be written by hand. And of course, the penmanship isn't going to be particularly easy for you to read. Also, do remember that you will want to look at different translation services so that, for instance, the double S's might be in place of F in a baptism announcement. Now, thank goodness, after 1812 in England, there were free printed forms. And so there was some uniformity in the actual filing at the church of the baptism. Also, a clue for those of you that are struggling to find maiden names. Sometimes the wife's maiden name is used at the middle name of the infant. So do pay attention if the middle name looks a little bit different, not a typical John or James or Michael, but rather a surname perhaps of the mother or the mother's family might be used in its place. When looking at the witnesses, I'm always looking for collateral relationships. That is the siblings of the parents or possibly extended family of the parents. And so you would possibly see people that you have not had an opportunity to research yet emerge as a witness as to a baptism that could have occurred. Also, there would be some date confusion in some countries. And so different countries adopted the Latin calendar versus the calendar that we use today. We'll talk a little bit more about dating patterns as we continue this presentation. Some of the nuggets of great information on the baptism certificate might even be the father's location, the location exactly of the ancestral village, the location of birth. So there could be some really gems of information that are shared on that particular certificate. So now let's talk about marriage records. Okay, the marriage records were going to be based in three major areas. The announcement that the couple wants to get married, which usually involved the priest or the minister meeting with the couple and giving them some premarital counseling. If he then determined that they were a suitable match, there were no problems, then he would allow them to announce their upcoming marriage. And what we refer to here are banns of marriage. Banns of marriage has to do with a public announcement 3 weeks in a row that this couple are intending to marry within that church. And last but not least, when the occurrence happens, the officiate may provide a marriage certificate to the couple. And I want to point out that not all officiates had the legal right in the jurisdiction that the church was located to actually issue a marriage license. So it's really important to understand that a marriage certificate is definitely a different document than a marriage license. Now, as things became more important going forward, many officiates obtain the legal right to marry, and at the time of marriage certificate also provide a marriage license to the couple. Now, the church was very interested in keeping these records of who was marrying whom. And the reason being is that the church wanted to prevent any couples that were closely related to marrying each other. We would call that inbreeding. And so this consanguineous relationships, as it was referred to, were monitored by different church functions. Now, of course, if you had money and prestige in your local community or in the nation that you were ruling, such as royal families, this particular bar for marriage might have been overlooked. So if you think about the houses in Europe of royalty, you do have a lot of royals marrying each other that obviously they were cousins. One of the couples that we would be aware of in the United States were the Kennedys. Joseph and Rose Kennedy were first cousins, and they had to appeal to the Diocese of Boston to get married. And so again, you may want to get, when you look at these records, you want to look closely to see if there is a possibility that these people could have been cousins on some level, but were allowed to marry because of the relationship. Now, one of the things that is an interesting wrinkle in marriages, especially in the United Kingdom, Great Britain, British Isles, was a topic that you may or may not be aware of, and that is Gretna Green. So a lot of people tried to skirt the law because they may have been underage or the parents did not approve. And so as a result, I've given you a couple of links here to the Ancestry Academy short videos on Gretna Green. So if you think that your ancestor might have been barred from marrying, in the church. Maybe that baby came a little bit earlier than what anticipated. They may have had a civil marriage by a rogue minister or a rogue priest, and then subsequently married in the church. So these are two great little videos for you to consider if you're not familiar with the term Gretna Green. Now, one thing that is also important for you to consider is the church ceremonial activity and other registers that the churches might have kept. And so when you look at civil licenses, there were civil licenses in colonial America as well. We also have the Quakers, who were a major religious group in colonial America, come together in specific meetings, whether the men met, the women met, or they met together. Quaker meeting notes are rich in information on how people may have lived, and they did not have ministers or priests per se. What happened in a Quaker meeting was that the couple announced that they were interested in being together, and the meeting was the witness to their declaration of love. And so if you are lucky enough to have Quakers in your heritage, you will want to find the Quaker meeting notes to see whether or not the community witnessed the coming together of your family. Now, some of the other church records or registers that might exist, and you may not have been aware of them, are school records, financial records, editorial comments. And so you may have had somebody in the church keep a record of what was going on at that church school, or maybe they were on the finance committee running the bills in the particular church. And so again, that might be a record that you might not have considered. One thing that's very interested in European records of various church communities is a term called the family book. In many cases, a low-level community worker would have been in charge of keeping a running account of what was happening in their community, including events at the church. And so if you're lucky enough to have a family book in your European village, you definitely want to get your hands on that to see whether or not there are any church records that you might be looking at. Now, in America, and of course in Europe, these church records may be a small fee for you to access. So again, you may want to go ahead and reach out to the local community and see whether or not they do have any type of fee that might be attached to researching your religious background in that area. Also, I want to point out that Ancestry.com have purchased the databases to all of the Methodist records. And so again, if you think that your ancestor might have Methodist roots, you will want to look at the Ancestry.com information for their records on the Methodist religion. Now, in the United States particularly, many colleges and universities had religious roots. If you think of William and Mary, or I went to Whittier College that had Quaker roots, many of them have records that are available to you. So reach out to a local university or a college that might have information to help you with your research. Make sure again that you always cite your sources so that you know that the information that you're providing on your family tree is accurate. So let's talk a little bit about death or burial records. So again, let's not confuse the religious ceremonies around death, but rather remember that vital records might have been filed in that jurisdiction stating the death of the individual and why they did die. And so again, the county, state, or any type of judicial records would be held in the local courthouse or the jurisdiction as opposed to the church records. again, keep in mind that whether it's a vital record or if it's a religious record, accuracy may not be the rule of the day. If people, of course, are in grief, the information that they may be sharing may not be correct, as well as the fact that the attending physician may not have been involved in the person's health care, and all he did was see the cause of death and sign off on the death certificate. Another thing that's extremely important is to understand that where the death occurred may not necessarily be where the burial occurred or the religious event occurred. So thinking about war, for instance, oftentimes there would be mass graves. And if you think of the Civil War, Gettysburg particularly, a lot of Southern families did not have the resources to send the bodies back home. Therefore, they all are interred in a mass grave. And so your ancestor may be transmitted to the family plot of his or her family. And so again, not too sure whether or not the death would have occurred, the burial would have occurred where the death occurred, but rather try to discover where the burial might have occurred based on facts that you can uncover from the family. Do remember that cemeteries and mortuaries and churches had quite a symbiotic relationship, so that many cemeteries were faith-based. If they were not faith-based in their entirety, they may have had sections of their cemetery blessed by either the Christian, the Catholic, or even the Jewish people in the area, so that there could be a burial that would be in the faith in the commercial cemetery. Mortuaries then would be handling the transportation of the body from the ceremony to the cemetery. So mortuaries could be a great resource for you to find out how people were actually buried and what was around the customs or the time of their death, what might have been at work. So tombstones speak to us from the grave, and you may want to look at what would have been engraved or carved into the tombstone. Or if you had a particular denomination, such as Catholic denominations, prayer cards would have been provided to those attending the funeral. And so on the prayer card, you may have had a picture of the deceased, their date of birth and the date of death, and a small prayer on the back of the prayer card. So these could be, again, part of the burial custom of that particular faith. Now let's talk a little bit about your dates on these documents. We have to keep in mind that using the right calendar when looking at BMD, birth, marriage, and death dates, is really going to be important for you to consider, because January 1st wasn't always the first day of the year. And so it's important to understand when the calendar was developed in the location of interest. And so depending upon the country that you are researching, the adoption of the calendar from the Julian to the Gregorian calendar might be different. And so if you remember from your early history of learning about the different calendars, it was based on the lunar cycle. And that's how we got leap years, so that we could then reconcile the lunar cycle and have, if you will, an extra day in February every 4 years. And so when Pope Gregory XIII was presented the calendar and noted the fact that there was a problem, the Julian calendar was 10 days off from the solar cycle. And so he then decided that he was going to go ahead and try to reconcile the calendar. And so we see sometimes in the record a double dating. And when we look at double dating, we would see a possibility of either a slash mark or the words OS or the initials NS. So either the initials OS or the initials NS. That would determine then that there was a calendar change and that you need to keep in mind the difference between what you think your ancestor may have been born or died versus what the calendar at that particular time in that country might have been. And so when you look at England and the American colonies, they didn't go Gregorian, as was referred to, until 1752. So they always lost an extra day. When you look at leap year, then the reconciliation of leap year then gave us January the 1st in the time frame of interest. And so a good example of this is George Washington's birthday. Kind of funny here. And it's important to understand it doesn't mean that the date of his birth is different or changed. It just is the way it's expressed. And so again, looking at the possibility that your ancestors' calendar date in the country of interest might be different than what you're considering. And so if you are looking at Russia, for instance, they did not adopt the new calendar until early 1900s. And so when I look at the map of the world, it is kind of an aha moment when you're thinking of the fact that you're trying to look for records about your ancestor that might have been in Portugal or might have been in Austria or Italy or even Turkey, and their adoption of the Gregorian calendar was much different. And you're thinking that it's all the same dates when you're looking at, for instance, Eastern Europe, particularly like Hungary and Bulgaria, Estonia, Poland. So keep that in mind in the back of your mind when doing your research, that January 1st might not always be the first month of the year, but to understand whether or not there was a change in calendar. Now, there's a really great converters that I've given you here in this presentation. The Rosetta calendar is available that you can convert between Julian and Gregorian, and the One Step from Stephen Morris is available too. The Ian's English calendar also is a good one for you to type in the Julian date and it'll give you automatically the Gregorian date. So this is a possibility that might be of interest to you because there could be a 11 days explanation of when somebody died and then when it is recorded, so that if you look at the information, be sure that you understand if it's indicating OS or NS in your writing. Also, you would see in the genealogy format, especially if you're new to genealogy, in America, we usually have the day, the month, and the year. Now, in most countries, the month and the day are changed. And so for Ancestry.com, for instance, it automatically is going to change the days for you. And so August the 11th might be written 8/11. However, in the European calendar, this would be November the 8th. And so remember, in genealogy, we always track via the European method of the month first and the day next. And so again, important for you to consider this. So important to know how to search for your BMD records. And the best thing you can do is to go to your timeline when you search the catalog. When you look at Ancestry.com and look at the church in your card catalog, you will see a lot of great information on Ancestry, on going ahead and tracking the card catalog in Ancestry. If you go to Family Search and go to the Research Wiki, it will give you church information by country, by state, or locale. And so that may be an opportunity for you to look at your church records. Make sure when you go to either of these sites that you go to the database to really understand what's being presented, because the church records could have been different. So I'm hopeful that this presentation, just the beginning, genealogy presentation on religious records, has given you an appreciation for the historical contents of the church that you're researching and how they may have kept records or not. And also how you might find collateral relationships, those witnesses, the people that may have attended the event. Make sure that you create your timeline and note if the calendar might have changed, especially if you're doing record search in Europe. And so that the different countries in Europe adopted the Gregorian calendar at a different pace than perhaps colonial America. And don't forget to verify your sources and to understand first and foremost, does a record exist that you're looking for? And if it is in existence, is it going to be in a hard copy? Is it going to be on microfilm, or is it going to be digitized? So I'm hopeful that this has given you a little bit better explanation on church records and all the different areas that you may want to research. Anybody have a question regarding church records?
Denise, thank you very much.
Oh,
Before we
good.
do questions, I have 3 comments from the audience.
Sure.
Um, First, in marriage situations, if you're looking for a marriage, recognize that most marriages, not all, but most, occur near the bride's home as opposed to near the groom's home.
Good point.
So, in looking, sometimes you're going to get a little confusion there. Second, if you're researching for where your ancestors came from in a foreign country, it is critical that you get the information, if at all possible, from this country's records, be they naturalization records, immigration records, whatever, to identify the specific parish as closely as possible, because that's where you'll find the records. And then the third comment I'd make is in the case of burials, the cemetery associated with a particular church literally may not be in the same county that the church is. So don't make the easy assumption that, well, of course, if Jane Smith went to this particular church, that's where, that's the county it'll be. And there's a famous example, which is that's how they discovered Barack Obama's Irish town of origin, was they knew where his ancestor had been married in the United States and found his tombstone in the next county. And on the tombstone was the name of the village he had come from in Ireland. Okay.
Also, a great locator is the city directories, because oftentimes city directories will have listings of all of the churches in that particular geography. And so if you're not quite sure the church that they may have attended, but you do know they were Episcopalian, then it might help narrowing how many Episcopalian churches that would be noted in the city directory. So that may be a possibility too.
Okay, do we have any questions in the audience here? Okay.
Thank you. Often when looking at marriage records, I happen to look at Italy, but I know it happens in many other places. The names from generation to generation or along laterally along a family line are the same. So you might run into 20 Giovanni Curtis or something, and they all are born close enough that you can't be sure. Are there any tricks about that the churches or any other religious affiliations used so that they knew the difference?
Well, it's extremely important for you to put your timeline together. Your timeline would automatically let you know that your Giovanni that you're looking for is the Giovanni in that church, because the timeline is going to determine first and foremost the right Giovanni. The second possibility is the occupation. Now, if you're looking at Italy, since it was mostly an agrarian country of city-states, everybody's a farmer, in other words. So that may not be as helpful as it would be in some other locations. But again, occupation would be another discernment that you could tell who is the who in that particular situation. The third thing that you have to consider is called name patterning. Every location has some type of name patterning that occurs ethnically. And so what is the ethnic name patterning that you need to be aware of? So for instance, in the Scandinavian countries, the father's surname is the base name for the entire family. When a daughter is born, the daughter information is added to the paternal name. When a son is born, his name is added to the root of the paternal name. And so again, that may be another way of you discerning who's who by simply understanding name patterning in the country of interest. So what you bring up is a really a great point, because that is a conundrum that we face all the time when we are looking at the record and we have multiple people with the same name. And as I say, the only thing I can tell you as a fairly straightforward opportunity here is your timeline, because the same Giovanni may or may not have been born in the timeline that you're researching. Of course, most of you already know that due to honoring a deceased infant, oftentimes the same name is given to the next born son or daughter that might have perished. And so again, that adds to the conundrum of finding out whether or not that is your guy or not. Again, relying on the timeline will help differentiate a child by the name who unfortunately died in infancy, and then subsequently another child is born given the same name in honor of the deceased infant. So hopefully that will straighten out, again, based on your timeline, could help understand who's who in your pedigree chart. Thank you.
Well, let me add two comments if I might. One is I have occasionally run into a situation where I had to create the family tree for 2 or 3 people in order to get to the point that I understood which of them was my person. Okay, because if you can do that, that allows you to eventually discern. It may be the youngest child of John and Martha turns out to be the one whose death certificate names her maiden name, which now allows you to get a piece of information you didn't have. Okay, which is another reason why you just keep religiously following the as much information as possible about all the members of the family. Okay, so any questions from the online audience? Any more questions here? Okay, Denise, thank you.
Yes, thank you. Appreciate.
Next month, we're going to have a diversion. I have been doing some research, which I have headlined Sally Hemings, Thomas Jefferson's Concubine. And I will be presenting the result of that research, which is a discussion about how a 12-year-old slave girl becomes a 17-year-old partner of one of the most powerful men in America.
Oh,
So it'll be a fun presentation, vaguely related to genealogy, heavily related to history. Okay, see everybody next month. Bye.
bye-bye.